I met Michael Hickey when he visited with Richard Owler, another pioneer of organics here in Ireland, back in 2019 on the occasion of Astria's 20th anniversary gathering, A Vision for the Future. In the after party, Michael introduced us to ideas from Aboriginal culture in which he had lived for a long time, which I found fascinating and were directly relevant to big picture perspective. In these cultures, people are brought up with a view of the universe in space and time and their position in it. So they see themselves connected to everything and playing a part in everything. Earlier this year, I was very lucky to be invited by Michael and Ute to visit their paradise in Tipperary, and we had a wonderful chat. The subjects and topics ranged from stacking shelves in the supermarket to changing course to consciousness to catalysing cultural progression. We hope you enjoy the recording.
Stoics, Tom.
Yeah, the porch dancers. Well, it's a nice way of thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Because philosophy is hidden in libraries and behind spiderwebs and such, and they use words which confuse us.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because those lads, the Stoics, were saying, this is what people should study, because that is about personal development. Understand yourself, know yourself, test yourself, challenge yourself, and that's how you develop your aptitudes.
Wasn't it amazing that so many different philosophies came out of a Greek period at the inception of Western thought?
I'm still a novice, I'm trying to understand it.
How Socrates and how Plato and those dissertations and so forth come down to us, and how they determined that societies could only really successfully operate democratically with a small city-state of not more than 10,000 people. Okay. And today we are still using the same methods, but what has happened in the distortion of democracy is that instead of representing us with ideas, they now represent us as people who want to be re-elected as soon as they are elected. So instead of looking for our good, they are simply staying in power.
It's not about the ideas, it's just about them.
It's about autocracy and wealth, and for some people it's power, and for some people it's wealth, and I don't know. I find it to be utterly depressing.
I'm saddened, having had an amazing education, not to have had any of the lessons of those that would learn thousands of years ago being presented to me in my education. It's a bit like my finance education. It's only recent. So I'm a financial engineer, done the big city, all that sort of thing. And it's only in the last few years that I've realized the paucity of my top education, Wharton Business School, IMD, the top of the top of the top. They did not mention other financial systems, other economic systems at all. Not once. They did not even explain the roots of capitalism in feudalism and slavery. It was just not on the menu. And half the time Adam Smith is misquoted. And it's shocking.
I remember when I went to university first, I studied economics, and the very first day the lecturer got up and he talked about an item is worth what you can get for it. And I was appalled, because in my mind, everything has an intrinsic value. And if you don't understand that intrinsic value, that's where the education should lie.
Very interesting.
But for me, that was the end. I couldn't continue. I mean, I'm a single-minded person, so that was it for economics for me. I couldn't have any belief any further. In the same way, I remember when I had my first job, I was becoming a supermarket manager in Sydney. And one day I was filling the tins of beans onto the shelf, and I suddenly realized that no matter where I go in this company, no matter how high I go or what I achieve, basically I'm selling tins of beans. And do I want to spend my life selling tins of beans? So I promptly went upstairs and resigned. But when you're that age, you can do those things.
You don't have the ties.
You also have this, I had this once an idea formulated in my mind, and I gave it some thought and decided. That was it. That was it. I mean, in the same way, very shortly after that, I left Sydney and put my rucksack back on my back and took off to find the wall that would find.
What sort of age were you?
Then 22. Yeah. So I was looking for the wall to crash against. I think we all look for a wall somewhere in our lives, you know, and for me, it didn't happen until I got to Alice Springs.
Alice Springs.
Alice Springs. And when I got to Alice Springs, I tried to leave Alice Springs and I couldn't get a lift.
Really?
Yes. And I was on the road going south and I said to myself, if I don't get a lift by 4 o'clock,
okay,
I'll stay here.
Very good.
And I did. And I stayed for 4 years and I lived out in the bush. And that was my wall. I mean, Alice Springs, I realized very quickly that if I took one step further south, I was returning. And if I was going back, I was retreating. So this was where I stood. And interestingly enough, Alice Springs is an utter conflict town. It's a conflict in every which way. It's a conflict in the sense of black-white, okay, the Aborigines and the white people, their civilizations crashing, not clashing, crashing.
Are both populations in the town?
They are in the town. I mean, except that they, not at all.
Sort of like,
no such thing. Right. No such thing. The black people live in the riverbed, literally, because the riverbed is dry most of the time, and the white people live in the houses. But I mean, you're talking about two civilizations, and that was brought home to me very clearly because an Aborigine man lived with me for a number of years, and we used to go out bush a lot, and he would go hunting. But I'm watching him, and he, when something would take place, when he would see something, he would sort of do this very, very artistic wave, and he'd say what it was he was seeing. And I watched this for quite a while, and then I realized that what he was doing, which was so different from what I was doing, was that he was scanning. And in scanning, he then ran the information past his computer, so he wasn't looking for a thing.
His actual computer?
His mental, yeah, his brain. Okay. Yeah, his own internal computer.
So he was processing.
And he ran it through, and he identified what it was, whereas I was looking for kangaroo, snake, whatever. He was looking for movement, sound, all the associated.
This is your Aboriginal friend.
Yes.
So I find that fascinating because what he was employing was natural talent.
Absolutely.
And we have covered over that with our so-called education. And I had a...
Yes, and now, just to finish that thought, instead of developing our intuition, which we were on the track of, especially here in Ireland.
Not just intuition, the actual ability to identify differences in two blades of grass next to each other just outside the window.
Okay.
Because that's how you see the tiger in the bush and not just grass.
Yes.
You save your ass.
Yeah.
And that skill set is now available to us when we scan sheets of numbers.
Yes.
Very quickly, much more quickly than we are actually reading them, to find the errors, to do our accounting or our database management or something like that. But the actual skill set has been wiped from our ability because as children we are not exposed to the diversity which nature offers.
We're not encouraged. Whereas for him, for instance, to give you an example, his sister was ill 150 miles away. And he came to me one day. Now I didn't know this. He simply came to me and he said, "Sister sick. Have to go." And he walked the 150 miles to visit his sister. When he came back, I asked him, how did he know his sister was sick? And he looked at me uncomprehendingly, and I realized that he had just simply been in communication with his sister. Now, I've had some instances of this in my life. I once went to a palmist who was not one of you'll meet a tall, dark stranger, but actually somebody who used to be in, I'm not sure what they call them, during the war in the Secret Service in India. And a woman came to him and told him that her husband had crashed and was injured on a mountain so many miles away. And he completely dismissed her. she came again the following day, and she said, if you don't do something quickly, my husband will die. And just to keep her happy, he actually sent somebody to check. And sure enough, they had crashed, and they were there. He changed his life utterly from that moment on, and he became involved in all sorts of alternative powers in India, to the point where he showed me his suitcase, that small suitcase that he kept under his bed, packed at all times, and ready to go when it was necessary for him to move. I was quite taken by this, and he was actually incidental in me finally just walking out of Sydney and taking off. But I thought that was and the same, all of these people that we come across, it's not what they do, it's how we interpret it and how we understand it. Okay. And that depends to a great degree on our preparedness. Okay. To, what do they say in India? When the student is ready, the master appears. But the master doesn't have to be a person. It can be an event, it can be. But if you're not, and in the same way, some people just need to barely touch an experience, and the entire experience is exposed to them. Other people need to absolutely be absorbed by the experience, and then they learn it. And other people go, why did he have to do that? Why did he have to submerge himself in it? But simply because one person is already aware of that experience, and the other person isn't. You know, in the same way, when I went to Alice Springs first, or before I got to Alice Springs, while I was traveling, I realized very quickly that everything that I knew was rubbish. Everything. That really, the only thing that I did know was nothing. And later in my life, I realized so many people who go searching, that's the first step. That's always the first step.
What do you mean? The first step to realizing nothing?
Yes. No, the first step to any kind of realization is that where you are is nowhere. Right. And when you do that, you make yourself available. You empty yourself out, and it's a process. In the same way that artists, when they create, traditionally, Eskimos, for instance, when they went fishing, I don't know whether they were Eskimos, but people who lived in the North Pole, they would take one spear, and they would go on a 3-day expedition. Now, when they throw that harpoon, it has to be right. I had a friend who was a photographer for Time magazine in Sydney, and he used to go on week-long expeditions, and he would take 3 exposures. He was a Malaysian man. He used to take 3 exposures with him, and he explained to me that it had taken him 25 years to come to that understanding, because most of what we do is pure waste.
And the irony is that today that's what we do, because we can just press the go button.
Exactly, and we have
I took a photograph of the moon the other day, and I couldn't take the photograph, so I just turned on the video camera and extracted a frame.
Yes.
Totally cheating.
Yes, why not? Why not? And to return to where we were in relation to the Aborigine.
Good.
I mean, we have, in fact, replaced our intuition with the phone that we all so much love.
Crutch.
As an example, we have externalized our intuition. We have given it over. We've given it over, yes, to other people.
This subject is very interesting, and it's timely, because in the field of looking for answers, as from my perspective outside of my world, there are, I suppose, 2 big questions that the intellectuals pursue. What is consciousness, and do we have free will? And when I say intellectuals, it's scientists, spiritual, metaphysical, paranormal, and all of these people are trying to answer these questions. And particularly in the, let me say, the next scientific evolution is, I think, what the group would like to say, that today our science is very much mechanistic, a mechanistic-based perception of reality. And although the science itself demonstrates that existence is not physical alone, it's both physical and metaphysical, the mindset and the institutional mindset of the scientific community has been to not look at the paranormal things like intuition, things like knowing that your sister 150 miles away is not well, and how those things might manifest. For example, like that non-local communication. How does that happen? So your experience in this field, this transformation that you chose, I think it's very important that you chose it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. But it's what...
You certainly decided no more stacking cans.
Yeah.
Because this is not real. And maybe your circumstances were accidental and fortuitous. Maybe you were on a path preordained. But
no, I have a lot of thoughts on that idea.
Good, because that's what's very interesting. And yesterday I was listening to the program director for the Scientific and Medical Network, a recording that he did a couple of weeks ago, exploring the history of these ideas. In fact, talking about things like life after death. What is the death experience? Talking about people like Bertrand Russell, who was imprisoned in his 90s, had these out-of-body experiences, and then found himself saying that if I had that experience in my physical body,
if I knew then what I know now,
I would have contradicted myself.
Yes.
But this is clearly something that needs exploration. And so the scientists
it's funny you should mention.
Not looking at it at all.
It's funny you should mention Bertrand Russell, because the first book that I read when I lived in Alice Springs was The History of the Western Civilization by Bertrand Russell. So it's just interesting. But I mean, in relation to that particular time, when I went to Alice Springs first, and after I what I became involved in was a lot of what people call now, what do they call it? What I called it then was time and motion.
The studies.
I imposed on myself a regime whereby everything that I did consciously. Okay. So if I dropped the knife, which then opened up a whole new idea, because I began to think about the idea of accident and coincidence and all of these kind of words. And I found that when I gave them considerable thought, and I'm talking about over a month, I couldn't continue to believe there was such a thing as accident or coincidence. I think that they're lazy words to describe something we don't understand, but they all have an explanation. And that led me on, I'd say, after a period of a year, to the idea of cause and effect. Now, that's very simple. We're all aware of it. But it's like accident and coincidence. We use the words, but we don't actually think about them. I mean, if you think about an accident is a causation caused by a number of different events coming together at a moment in time, something like that. Now, is that something that couldn't happen or happened by coincidence? It happened because a number of incidents took place that made it absolutely impossible for that not to happen. But the difference is that we don't understand the events that led up to it. But varying degrees of intelligence allow varying people to understand more of the events, and we call them experts. Okay. But for the average person, if they want to trace aspects of themselves, they can do it fairly readily if they have the time and the inclination. Now, I had the time and I had the inclination, so I spent a number of years writing. And what I actually started to do was to actually take my life apart. And I was living outside the town, so I had very little contact with people. Once a week, that was all. So mostly I spent the time alone. So I could actually disassemble myself, take the parts off, have a look at them, give them a good clean, and put them back. Now that,
for example?
Well, just simply what happened to me at various points in my life. Right. But that left me emotionally vulnerable. And I was extremely vulnerable at that time. Had a harsh event taken place, I wouldn't have been able to cope with it. And I was aware of this. So the trick was to stay out of harm's way while I was doing this kind of thing. But it led on to this understanding of cause and effect. And cause and effect, as far as I'm concerned, just about explains all of our world. If we were more aware of cause and effect, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing to our earth. We couldn't. Any farmer understands cause and effect in as much as how it affects his life. He sees that if he doesn't plant the seed in February or March, it's not going to grow. And if he doesn't do A, B, and C, and most of us understand that in our lives. Now, to varying degrees. Unfortunately, if we take marriage as an example, it's the one thing that we're allowed to do without years of training and without any understanding of what's expected from us. But in fact, it's probably the most monumental thing that most of us do in our lives and requires complete dedication for at least a period while you're bedding down the two personalities, while they're getting to know each other and while they're really understanding and listening to each other and while they're fighting out whatever bits they need to fight out.
You always marry the wrong person. Have you heard that?
Yeah. I think we sometimes have relationships with the wrong person while we're looking for the right person. Right. Generally speaking.
The argument that he gives is, this is School of Life. I've just done the lecture and the mini option, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's a little bit of, and it's, the explanation is relevant to what you've been explaining about knowing how things happen, perhaps. Is this perhaps the cause and effect phenomenon? And it's about our emotional development as humans. And perhaps our emotional development was far more sophisticated when we were in more human, smaller communities, village-type environments, and people had to interact with one another in a local environment than we do today. Those Aboriginal communities, I'm sure that the people in there, they were emotionally developed, they understood themselves and others around them.
I don't think so, Tom.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah. What they say is that because we grow up without understanding of the relationships we're exposed to, and we never then discuss them once we have the aptitude to have the conversation. We grow up with emotional baggage, which we don't realize we're carrying. And what we're seeking in our partner, in that person, are things
our mirror
that may have been abusive to us as children.
Yes.
And we grew to rely on a bit. What's that? The Stockholm syndrome. So if your parent is not good to you, that might become the thing you like.
Yeah. Interesting enough, the first relationship that people generally have is somebody who looks like themselves. It's when the ego is very strong and misunderstood and not understood. And it develops as we go along. And we usually pass that relationship. If we marry that partner, it usually ends fairly rapidly. Then we, as you say, we get attracted, this is in my understanding anyway, we get attracted to our foibles, all the aspects of ourselves that are, you could call negative. And that person engenders those aspects, and we fight them in that person. Now, if we're fortunate, we resolve those issues, and together we move on. But generally, it's not the case. But eventually, I think there is a situation, or there are people who have more promise for one another than other people. And they're monumental people in our lives. Now, if we're fortunate, I mean, this would lead me on to a very interesting subject, and that is the idea of reincarnation. When I was a child, I could not understand why I was born where I was. Why wasn't I black? Why was I Catholic? And why was I all of these different things? Why was I here? Nothing in my surroundings would explain this. And I carried this for years and years and years. But I began to realize that you have a section of the world that believe in evolution, that believe in what do the Hindus believe? They believe that we're reincarnated, and we can be reincarnated as worms, or we can travel backwards and forwards and so forth. But I think the fact is that we as human beings have aspects to us, and we have an ego, and we have something that we Christians describe as soul. And I think a lot of different religions describe it as soul. It's an inner person who, for instance, in my time in motion period in Alice Springs, I awakened this other person, this watcher, I called him. And he became an awful problem after a while, because my watcher and my ego were equal. And I used to do things like, for instance, mad as it may sound, I would try to sneak up on myself. I would, in the bathroom, suddenly flash in front of the mirror, try to catch a view of this person. Ridiculous as it may sound. And later I found out this is actually a phenomenon that a lot of people try. Anyway, as this progressed, I began to understand that aspect of me that is eternal chose my parents, my surroundings, my family, and for this particular evolution. Now that's a bit of a jump, but anyway. And these understandings I would emphasize are things that I came to. I have no proof of any of this, but most of these understandings have remained relevant in my life, and I would still believe them today. So that it gives me an understanding of why you have your particular intelligence and your particular path and so forth, because you have an evolution which is totally separate from mine in one sense, but conjoined in another sense. And until such time as you complete all of your evolution, I will never complete mine. So it's in my interest, if you like, to actually aid and abet you in your evolution in as much as I can. But my responsibility does not extend past those that are in my strata. And that strata is not something that's written down. It's something, if we refer back to the economic fact, which has an intrinsic value, it's the same thing for a person, in the sense that you have to understand who your strata is. Nobody's going to tell you. And that's where your responsibility lies. People always say, oh, I feel so responsible for those poor people in India. Well, I've been to India. I've lived with poor people. Some of them are the most realized and the funniest and the most rounded people I have ever met. So in a lot of cases, our responsibility is to ourselves. And if we can separate ego and soul and see them as distinct entities, deal with them, and the ego is very necessary to preserve our form while we move through this life. So it has a function. You can't deny it. And I tried to deny it in Alice Springs.
It's a good, healthy exercise.
It certainly is. And I fasted, and I did hours and hours of yoga, and I walked in the desert, and I did all of the things that lunatics and locust eaters are supposed to do. Eventually, I had to transcend the division. But it took a long, long time. I mean, you create the division for a purpose. And then...
Sanity.
Yeah.
At the beginning.
Yeah, it leads to consciousness. It leads to consciousness, because to become aware of yourself and your wholeness is the first step, I think. And when you've made that step, lots of things follow.
You've touched on two areas which of very great interest to me, which I kind of disagree with.
Good.
So I would like to bring you back to the two ideas.
Right.
Just to
explore them a bit.
Yeah, and because you have obviously a personal, real, actual experience of pursuing a path metaphysical path, the spiritual path, if you will, and you've succeeded.
I wouldn't say that, Tom.
Well, what I mean is the path was there.
Yeah,
The path that you sought was there, and you followed it, and look what has happened. You have created an imagination in reality. So the two ideas, which I have I've thought about, and I have many contradictions which I can express, and I will try to restrain myself from doing so. The two ideas are the cause and effect / accident idea and the reincarnation idea. And if it's a bit cheeky, but if I can just give a little nugget on where I'm coming from the two ideas. Accident is a big word for me because it's what I use to describe existence. Existence is an accident, that's what I say. I say there is no other way of explaining it because we can't look and examine prior to the beginning of space-time. And the cause happened before space-time existed.
Yes.
I can only say it was an accident.
Yes.
And I can frame it in the context of what we understand about how things happen now. And that's what I do with everything from the, this to the everything. Because I say, the patterns in nature are similar and repeated at all scales, from the micro subatomic to the universal.
Yes.
Those patterns are there. So I can sort of see the similarities, and I can couch the accident idea in those patterns. And by the same token, I can look at what we have here and accept the accident of it. And the reason, after sort of saying, okay, well, I'm just going to call that an accident. Bang, the world started. An accident.
Let X equal.
Accident. Go. Subsequent to that sort of notation in my head was reading up about what is happening in string theory, quantum theory, and so on, and what is understood to be the case is that at the subatomic level there is a probability element of whether or not the subatomic particle will behave in this way or that way. And that probability is illustrated by things like the idea that light can be a particle or a wave.
Yes.
Depending on the observer. Okay, right, and then you bring the observer, and that's another aspect which is a huge bifurcation in the scientific community at the moment, at the level of consciousness and metaphysical behaviors, that, should we include the observer or not? And the people who are sort of really pushing forward are saying, yes, of course you have to use the observer because that is everything.
Yes, this is a repeat of the conversation.
So there's the accident.
Yeah.
I say, yes, there are accidents and there are probabilities, but there is free will and there is choice.
Oh, yes.
So that
all through it.
So the cause and the effect, the dropping of the knife, there are accidents.
The Chinaman who goes to America and a brick falls on him from the 12th story.
I put it into what I call the cosmic rhythm.
Yeah.
Okay, and if we find the ability to surf the cosmic rhythm, we can make better choices. And what I have decided is that the cosmic rhythm does not involve getting 3 Bentleys outside my front door.
No.
Because that is not how the universe works.
No.
That is a part of how the universe has worked in the emergence of complexity.
It doesn't sound like we have a disagreement here, Tom.
No. Okay, so then reincarnation.
Right. Well, I wouldn't call it reincarnation. I could call it the continuum. Okay,
fair enough. That's what I want to know more about, because my perspective is that, obviously my perspective is that there is a metaphysical dimension, and that there is a soul or a spirit, or whatever you want to call. But for me, my spirit is like my body. It is an accident of the mud that went into making me. And yes, it exists, but when I stop existing, it also will fade and dissipate and become one with the rest of the spirit.
It will, you're right.
So there is no continuum of the Tom spirit.
No, wait a minute now. Wait a second. Wait. Hold on here, Tom.
In the universe.
Hold on. Are we mixing up the spirit that you refer to and the ego, Tom?
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a question that we could look at.
Yeah, and maybe
because I think
the difference comes. But what I don't believe is that there is any part of me that persists. There is nothing of me that persists. There are things that made me so. If anything that persists from me there may be a legacy in, say, for example, the people, you, my children, and that might have been an effect, and a ripple of me being the stone in the water that made ripples, and sure, they affected the pond.
Interesting thing, the stone and the ripple. I thought about that for a long time. The ripple doesn't end when it meets land.
It vibrates
through the universe.
But
the butterfly's wing
becomes a part of the smoke.
Yes, and you become a part of the smoke, but your understanding. There's a law in nature whereby something that's unused disappears, but it doesn't become extinct. No energy can be removed from the earth.
Correct.
It transforms.
It's the behavior.
And all things are...
Operates with other bits of that random accident of existence.
But all things are available to the person who knows how to look and where to look. All understanding is in front of our noses at all times.
Have you heard of Morphic Resonance?
No, but it sounds good.
Okay. Well, Morphic Resonance is a hypothesis proposed by a few people, but principally, I'd say, Rupert Sheldrake, who was a biologist.
Oh, I've read his son.
That's right, the musician.
Yeah, no, the fungi man.
Okay.
Yes, anyway.
Well, mushrooms might save us.
Mushrooms, according to him, are
first.
Yes, anyway.
Paul Stamets on mushrooms is a good one as well. He's very, he's the guy with the mushroom hat.
Californian or... Yeah. He's an American.
Oregon, maybe.
Oregon, yes. Anyway, get back to where we were.
Oh dear. Where were we?
Yeah. Ego and awareness and...
The ego won't stick around. It's just
transient.
Soup.
Yeah,
soup.
Absolutely.
So the challenge for me is when I hear stories from people who talk about communicating with, whatever it was, the great grandparents.
Yeah.
And they sound, there are some, very well regarded, let me say, natural scientists, because they were back in the 1800s and before, who laid a foundation which people are standing on today to say, yes, the ghostly form of Bertrand Russell, for example, is still around.
Yes.
And I would say that I need more to understand how that actually manifests, even in a metaphysical sense.
Yeah. Why should that be necessary?
Because what they're saying is different to what I'm saying. And I think people have to be comfortable with the idea that their existence is transitory.
Yeah.
And no, they do not come from a pre-incarnated entity, and they do not evolve through time themselves, and they will not become something else in the future.
Yeah. I don't think... Yeah. I understand what you're saying, but I don't find any difficulty with these things because I don't have any desire to continue as I know myself. It doesn't matter to me. My awareness and understanding, I always think of these things, and it depends on how you want to conclude these kind of ideas, but I always think of to kind of try to determine the beginning and the end is a bit like trying to climb a ladder that goes to the sky. When my awareness reaches the point where I'm capable of doing that, it will be accessible to me.
Very good.
But for the moment, I don't indulge my ego if I possibly can, because it'll overtake me. It's always there.
It always comes and kicks you in the ass.
Yeah, well, hopefully. I think it's my soul or my spirit that kicks me in the ass. My ego is always trying to say to me...
Well, you've been very aware of yourself, and that's been the bounty.
It's a help. It's a help, but it can be... No, but let me give you another thought, which I found really interesting. I was in a river one day, getting up to something that perhaps I won't share with you. And I suddenly had this realization that the idea of Adam and Eve was a fable. That the Old Testament is a collection of fables that have come down through time and been interpreted and reinterpreted and been used by various power blocks to control people. And I said to myself, what if the Garden of Eden was unconsciousness, was the animal state, and us humans were in the animal state, which was totally abandonment. We had no responsibility for any action that we took. Heaven. Eve, our wonderful partner, realized this, or may have one day...
I love this. Keep going.
Yeah, offered us the idea of consequence.
Yeah.
And we accepted it.
May I suggest that she offered the idea of love?
Whatever you want to call it.
Well, it is consequence, but what really... Go on.
Okay, really consequence.
Me down.
Yeah.
This is really... it's good.
Okay, consequence. Let's leave it at that for the moment. So what that meant was, as soon as we began to realize that we had a responsibility or we had a part in the action and what happened afterwards, we started to concern ourselves. And in so doing, we removed ourselves from unconsciousness.
Yes.
We threw ourselves out of the Garden of Eden.
Yes. I love the analogy. I love the analogy because...
But that's the basis.
We have to look at the wild beasts to understand our own nature.
Yeah, but that's the basis. The Garden of Eden, Tom, just continue that for a second. The Garden of Eden is the basis of Judeo-Christian thought. One of the fundamentals. If we were to change that, think of the consequences. Think of the dominoes. Think of the change in our male-female relationship.
That's awareness. I mean, that's, okay, so the story is wonderful. The way you put it is brilliant because, for me, it matches very closely with what I see happening in the emergence of consciousness.
Why is it we always like when somebody agrees with us?
Well, let's see if I agree with you.
Okay.
Let's see if I agree with you. One has to start with the natural world.
Yeah.
Look at the monkey for the animal instinct in the human, and look at the behavior, the anthropological interpretation, whatever, and so on. And that's a fair reference point because clearly we're close in every respect. And it would be foolish to say that they don't think, that they don't have many, if not all, if not all of the aptitudes that we possess, including that sense of non-local events, which we feel like the man and his sister, like me and my granny, whatever it was, that kind of connection. We don't understand it, but it's in a monkey and it's in us. So, what is interesting is that the monkey doesn't lie. Okay, that's a human ability. It's about imagination. It's about being able to create things that don't exist. That is lying. And animals can't do that. Humans cannot do it until they are, I think it's 1 or 2 years old. There are sort of processes where you can see that a child can be deceived at a certain level and then they can't be deceived because they realize that lying is allowed and you can create things that don't exist. And that isn't the element of consciousness suddenly breaking forth. That's the Garden of Eden suddenly changing from being the animal, which has no responsibility because I'm just a part of whatever's going on here, to becoming consciousness. And that's, again, it's the
evolution of the human.
Of the universal. not the human. You see, we keep putting it back to the human. But it's in the animal. We have this capacity which is emerging in existence for us to think bigger. And part of that emergence is to understand ourselves, look after ourselves, protect ourselves, and we've gone through that sort of increasing complex value system where, oh, you know, I need to breathe. Oh, I need food. Oh, I need shelter. Oh, I need friends. Okay, now what am I going to do with my life? But at that point, when you come to terms with yourself and you begin to know yourself, which of course most of us have just not bothered with because we're too keen on climbing the ladder, then we start to become useful and we start to integrate. We start to become strategic thinking and organizing. I'm going to go from A to B. We start to talk about collaboration, working with others to go from A to B. And once we've sorted out those kinds of behaviors, which are quite sophisticated in groups of more than a few people, the love happens. And that's why I said the love about Adam and Eve, because what is clear is that it is altruism, which allows us to step beyond our ego. When we give ourselves up for the benefit of the whole, and when we can give ourselves up, not just for the benefit of our community or for humanity, but for the everything, then we are behaving in a natural way. And that is where we may go. Because certainly the people who are altruistic are the people who are displaying, manifesting that capacity for love and making good things. Truth. In my view. So I love that idea. I think religion is deadly because it is not thinking. So even if we change the story, I think the Pharisees and the priests and all the rest of them will conjure up some other...
Sure, of course they will. Of course they will. But
that's why I think people have to face the reality that it's them, it's here, it's now, there's no before, there's no after. Live in the present, find yourself. Be you.
Yeah, I think most of our movement is incremental, and I don't think realizations strike as, what would you call it, universal understandings. Yeah, I think it's individuals first, and then it groups. Spreads. And
surely it is the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We cannot be altruistic if we have no food. So the fact that there are 3 billion people starving on this planet is shocking, and obviously. Why would we expect them to do so? On the other hand, our recent divorcee, he can do things which he does not do. He continues to try to control rather than to liberate. He continues to think that his solutions are the solutions. And it is destroying not just himself, but everything around. The opportunity which you talk about of that enlightenment for all of us, that's what I put on the table in front of people. I say, forget about the bag of gold. Because if in your head and in your consciousness and in your spirit, you find out, you can learn to actually access it and be a part of it, can you imagine the joy and good feeling? Sex all the time.
I think. I mean,
I'm sure that's what the old philosophers were striving for and saying, oh, you know, I'm happy even if I'm on my knees picking stones from the field, because in my head I'm doing something good for others and I'm in paradise.
I think for every individual it's different. Some people are briars and some people are oak trees, and the rest of us fall in between. Some of us require a dream. Traditionally, cultures would allow their youth to go into seclusion and find for themselves a dream which would direct their lives. And this was actually encouraged. This has gone by the way. But once upon a time, this was a common thing. The Indians in America, for instance, would go onto the mountains. And for some people, this dream would only last them a year, and they'd have to repeat it. And for other people, they would do it once in their lives, and that would direct them for the rest of their lives. Neither one was right. In the same way, what we're talking about here, for everybody,
what is interesting...
Is that you, Tom? Yeah.
Yeah, what is interesting is that those societies, those cultures, lived in harmony with one another and with the world. I think, you can look at the North American Indians.
They didn't live in harmony with one another. They were constantly battling for territory and... I mean, this is what I found with the Aborigines, for instance.
Well, that's what I wanted to, because you had a really intimate experience. I was wondering how they...
I had many experiences with them. I remember one night, for instance, I worked in a night shelter for Aborigines. They suffered a lot from alcoholism.
Yep.
And in their confrontation with white society, they fell foul of alcohol. And alcohol was their one weak spot. Now, interestingly enough, my man had a lot of insights into his own society, but he expressed them in short staccato sentences. And unless you really listened carefully to him, you missed. To give you an example, he used to sit on the pillion of my motorcycle, and we were passing along Railway Terrace one day, which is a street in Alice Springs, and he tapped me and he said, "The peoples insult me. The white peoples insult me." And I thought about this, and and finally I realized what he was saying. When white people in Alice Springs, in my time, passed Aborigines, they would give them a wide berth. They would actually detour around them. If they were in a motor car, they would inadvertently push the accelerator. Aborigine people stink as far as white people are concerned. The interesting thing is...
No, is this like...
Physically.
But is it in reality?
Yes, in reality. No, in reality. But the interesting thing is, if you ask an Aborigine, white people stink to Aborigines. It's a cultural difference. But this was how Paddy expressed this. He understood this, but he wasn't able to articulate it. He was insulted by the manner and by the way the cultures met physically on the street.
Do you think it's still like that? I mean,
I'm sure it is. They have huge problems there still. It's a confrontation.
I faced this issue of smell from a young age, ironically, and it's something that I've learned to appreciate.
Yeah. Totally. Once you understand something as a cultural difference or whatever, then you can...
It wasn't even cultural for me, because I grew up in different communities, like foreign communities.
Yeah.
It wasn't the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant upbringing that my peers had.
Yeah.
So I said, oh, well, different people smell differently in different circumstances.
Yeah.
And even one person... they're different between individuals, but it's not about, I'm white and you're black, or I'm from this country and you're from that country. It's just individuals, and what they do. Yeah. Because when I went into the carpentry shop, I could smell the carpenter.
Sure.
But the carpenter's working his ass off all day. And if I met him in church, he'd smell a lot different.
Yeah. But the reason I tell this story is not that Aborigines smell or white people smell.
But they couldn't come to terms with
it. It's the understanding of the person that amazed me, and how he expressed it, and how, if you're willing to listen.
So did he see it as a kind of prejudice, or did he?
He didn't understand it.
Did he take it as a personal insult?
He felt it as a personal insult, but this was probably the first time in his life that he articulated it in some kind of form.
Okay.
And if I could have passed that comment without hearing it at all. And what I'm trying to say here is simply that if you're ready for the understanding, it'll drop. You don't have to do any particular...
It's very interesting, Michael, because just your experience as I hear it, I keep thinking that it's, you know, the choices you made, but you know, maybe the first one of just going away.
That was running away. It wasn't going away.
So it wasn't a choice, but that was what did it. You found yourself in a different environment.
But only because...
And an unprotected one as well.
Yeah.
Because when one runs away to the posh boarding school, or one runs away to the colonial posting, you're not really running away because you're still with all your peers and you don't actually get exposed to the reality of how different people live in different parts of the world or in different professions and so on. If you can get that exposure, if you can step out of the white carriage and walk down the alleyway to buy your vegetables and smell reality, then you start to think a little bit about how the world really is.
I think, Tom, if I'd had the choices, I mean, right from when I go back through my own life, it was, I remember when I was 3, understanding that people are cruel. Now, I had an extremely happy childhood, but when I was 3, around 1953, 54, myxomatosis was introduced. And I was in a field and I see these rabbits with pus pouring out of their eyes. And first of all, I see them and I think, oh, lovely rabbit. And then they're walking into streams and drowning. And my mother explained to me this was myxomatosis. And I understood this, that people can be cruel in some part of me. But that understanding formulated a twist in my understanding as I grew. And my next piece of understanding in relation to that was when I was 9, I think, or 8, a child who was mentally challenged was asked a question in class by a rather kind Christian brother who never questioned him up until that point in time. And because he wasn't able to answer, he had to punish him, because that was the law of the class. If you didn't answer, you got leathered. Jesus. Now this boy simply pulled his hand when the brother tried to leather him, which he did it 3 or 4 times, and the class were erupted.
Good.
No, erupted in mirth.
Yeah.
They were delighted with this. What happened was, the senior Christian brother crashed through the door, sized up the situation, grabbed your man's hand, whacked him 6 times, and marched out the door. What that taught me was not simply that a child will be, but that a benevolent person can cause just as much damage as the one who came in and did the damage. That was a very, very important moment for me in my life. So you had the 2 pieces of understanding. So all of these things that happened as I moved along formulated the way my life went. They weren't conscious decisions. If I had had my choices, I would have had the 2 cars outside the door. I would have succeeded at commerce and become an accountant or whatever my mother wanted me to be as an idiot child. But unfortunately, because of the events that had taken place in my life, I wasn't capable of doing it. So when that lecturer said, you know, because I was the person that I was, I switched off immediately. No more could I, because I knew that if I went a step further, in the same way my aunt used to come to my mother, and my mother...
When you say lecturer, you're talking about the economics.
Economics, yes.
Yeah.
In the same way that my mother used to get her relations to speak to me, to say things, to try to encourage me to finish my degree. It doesn't matter what you do, just finish your degree. But I knew that if I finished my degree, I would never become the person that I wanted to be. Now that's a very negative kind of way at coming at life.
Well, I find it very fascinating and interesting for so many reasons, and it begs a couple of questions.
Okay.
But leaps from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
From, 50 years ago to today.
Yeah.
Because I suppose trying to find a justification for staying on the good path, as it were, given what's going on around me in this crazy world. And so I suppose I'm wondering what insights you might offer in terms of how we can better prepare ourselves to find ourselves, to make those choices. And in the context of that question, sort of question one.
It's a big one.
Yeah, but I'm going to narrow it down a little bit.
Okay.
Because we have children. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to give our children the perspective that we had. And we know that our perspective came from the accident of our upbringing. And that I cannot give my children anything like the experience that I had.
Hallelujah.
I know that they are going to have, well, not in some ways, they do complain a bit because I did have it good.
Yeah.
But moving forward, I sort of have to recognize that they will have their own experiences. But are there situations and so on that one can present or nurture or encourage so that they have those realizations of the natural dynamic and the behavior, so that they develop the moral compass, if you will.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because here we are with young. Was that me?
It's a bird.
Like an actual real bird?
No, it's a clock.
Okay.
Yeah.
How can we do it for everybody? It gets back to what can we do in education? We were talking about the porch stompers and saying that, the personal development is all about knowing yourself, developing a moral compass, challenging yourself through difficulties, not through luxuries, so that you can move on. I think people forget that Socrates was a successful military general before he allowed himself to be trodden on by the Athenian elite.
The Buddha challenged himself through luxury.
The prince.
Through luxury.
So
I don't think, to answer that question...
What do we do for our children? What do we do for...
No, we can't. We can't, Tom. I mean, if I look back...
tools that we can
no, absolutely. No, we... The apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Mud and gold.
We have to. We have to. we have to have faith in people and in our children, and courage that they will choose the path. I mean, if you were to take my two boys, I have two boys, one is 26 and one is 20. They are diametrically opposite. They have none of the same attributes.
There we go, mud and gold come from the same hole.
But one is 26, he's fine, he's charting his own course. He doesn't believe any of the things that I believe. I don't labor him with them. No. He has his course, he has his evolution my understanding allows me the luxury of allowing people to be. My son, I constantly say to my wife, leave him alone. He always gets there. He has his way of doing it. He may just scrape through, but he always gets there. That tells me that he's looking for something else. He's just fulfilling the quota to get him by without being noticed. But he's looking. His, whatever you call them, receptors are open. And when the bit comes that he needs, he'll hang on for dear life. And he is tenacious. So...
But I think that's very good advice for any parent and possibly any government. Facilitate and liberate.
And liberate, yeah. My son has no interest in the farm. My second son, absolutely none. None whatsoever. Would I push him and force him to work at something he hates? Absolutely not. The other one understands farming intrinsically. It's in him. But I don't force him to do it. Away with him. Experience life. He did a degree in philosophy. I mean, he hasn't lived any of that philosophy. So he needs to put life experience to that philosophy, or continue his life experience, so that one will catch up with the other. And in relation to something that you were saying earlier, I don't think that any one path or any one having empathy or seeking love or anything is the answer. I think there's a wholeness that has to take place, and some things race ahead and we give them huge attention because we have a hole in that area. And for me, my spiritual path ended when I wouldn't say my spiritual path, that has continued, but my complete devotion to that path ended when I realized that the one element in my life that I lacked in wholeness was love. And the only way that that was exposed to me was through a relationship.
This is very exciting.
So I completely changed course, left Alice Springs, and followed a relationship. And to this day, I am still following a relationship.
I think that's...
Not in the sense that two become one, but two travel side by side.
That's lovely. And I'm really glad we came to that part, because you offered the insights about personal development, facilitation and liberation, not control, not forcing somebody on a path. And I think most of us have been forced.
Certainly, absolutely.
And it's a rare person who cops on to the fact and steps out of the rails. I'm going to choose now. But you brought it back to relationships. And relationships are what make us happy, in a way. Certainly, as people age, they might start their lives looking for the 2 cars and the bag of gold, but past 50, whether they have the gold or not, most of them are longing to have relationships.
Yes, the yin and the yang. We are the feminine and the masculine.
So then it really prompts the neglected piece of the puzzle. We are a patriarchal culture society on the planet today, and it is not healthy. And we talk these talks and we reflect and we say, oh, well, who are the female philosophers and so on. And so are there insights which you have gleaned, perhaps from your relationships, and more importantly from the recognition, which I believe must be shared by the person with whom you have the relationships, about the dynamic and the approach. But
I'm not sure about that, Tom.
Fair enough.
I don't think it's necessary even.
Good.
Yeah, we come at things for different reasons.
What is the feminine part of the puzzle? Is there a feminine perspective
Absolutely.
in this world of consciousness and personal development and emergence, which we have neglected because we grew up in a patriarchal culture?
And empirical thinkers, as opposed to lateral thinkers.
Or, nurturers. We were the ones who wanted to kill the beast instead of nurture the kid. And I'm using that very black and white, which it certainly wasn't. There was nowhere they caught beasts without both the boys and the girls being
but as a...
The mindset is a different... sometimes I think that we're 2 different species who happen to coexist for reproduction.
And it's a wonderful subject to investigate. It's a wonderful subject. And we can, to some degree, and do it solo. But it's so much easier to do it with a partner. I mean, as we keep singing about, love is the answer to everything, ultimately. Unless we have love. And those people that have love emanate happiness. And they have no ability to go wrong, because if they have reached that point, and I certainly haven't reached it, but I strive to reach that point, because...
You certainly help create it for others. I feel it.
Well, that's good. I'm glad of that, but I certainly don't feel that I emanate it all the time. Sometimes I walk around here and my head is just completely on the ground, And other times it's fine. I mean, this house, for instance, is dedicated to communication. I think communication is, if we can communicate, if we can talk, if we can sit here and express ideas in a positive way, then we have a chance to learn. But if I only want to teach you or to learn from you, then we're not communicating.
It's not a dialectic. We don't have the same objective.
No.
To find the answer together.
Yes. Yes.
That I think has been missing from
Yes.
all of our communications,
Yes.
all of our education,
And
all of our family lives.
Right. I have found in my experience that I have learned some very fundamental things from the most ignorantly stupid people.
Or at least
Simply because...
considered to be ignorant and stupid by our culture, because oftentimes the person at the bottom of the society who has the wisdom that you don't find in the chieftain.
Yeah. Often they were the stupid people, but they had one piece of the puzzle. And that was enough. That was enough for them. And if you were open to them, they would express that to you. And you could appreciate it and thank them for it. And everybody has that experience with people. We don't have to elevate them past a certain point. They don't have to be the noble savage or anything like that. No. They can just be, they can throw a spear well because they have longer arms than anybody else or whatever. And if you can understand why it is and appreciate that in them, then you can give them confidence in that ability and no more. You don't have to make them into the leader. You just have to say thank you and move on. And that's the only responsibility we have to one another.
My challenge, what you say is helpful, and I find it a challenge sometimes to discern what a person sees as their thing.
But they don't even have to see it. They can just be it.
Sometimes it's very important to be able to show a person that you recognize their competence so that they may have the confidence in their emergence. Now, that is not something which has affected you for 50 years, maybe more. But I do know, I mean, I've certainly, as a, nurturing children, bringing them up, I'm a hard person. I grew up in a kind of more of a disciplined environment. And I felt that mollycoddling is not healthy, and that to some extent was a mistake, because mollycoddling is not healthy, but one also needs to give the
affection and
the cuddles and so on. And I didn't give enough time to that. It wasn't that I wasn't affectionate, it was that I was too caught up with my own.
Well, I don't know. I don't think so. I think you're a bit hard on yourself, Tom. I think that was part of your culture. Your particular culture, the line of descent that you came from. I mean, you have to take that into account.
That was what I did, and I found that challenging because most other people...
Yeah, but you're aware of it now.
I am, but they were never. So I would do things taking this whole other issue into account, and they would say, but why are you thinking like that? Because they wouldn't appreciate that.
Sure.
And maybe that's the thing. So I'm looking at the young people growing up, and I'm sort of saying, okay, so what do I have to recognize? What talent must I recognize in the young person so that they recognize it in themselves and they feel the confidence so that they can move to the next step?
Oh yeah, that shouldn't...
Because if I keep telling them, can you do better in school, or whatever it is...
That shouldn't be difficult. I visited your house once and I met, I think, one of your sons. And I was blown away by how articulate he was, how he was in command of his...
Must have been somebody visiting all the time.
No, it was your son. How he could express himself so well, and how he had views on things which were his personally, because I spoke to him specifically. And...
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
He was obviously one of the switches in the hospital or something.
No,
he's a great man.
I think it's
he's
always...
the one that's going to stop me being a parent in a few days, finally.
I think it's always easier for people outside to see. I mean, if you're living...
To deal with the...
Sure, if you're living with somebody hour to hour, minute to minute, day to day, and so forth, it's hard.
He gave me a piece of his mind a couple of days ago.
Good.
It's reverberated in the local village.
Good, I would imagine, Tom, just like me, small doses is sufficient. We're all tyrannical in some way. We're all of the elements.
Oh, I can't fault my children because I know my own past.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. Well, at least they understand that in the weakness of the way you deal with them. It's a positive rather than a negative, if you understand me, because you're brought up in a particular way. I was brought up in a particular way, and it's by faltering that we change that, by actually saying, I don't believe this way anymore, but this way is so strong, it went on for generations and generations. You choose to be born into the, as I see it, to be born with the parents that you had, to give you both the positives and the negatives that you had to fight to actually become an individual. And that's why I said to you this morning when you came in, the king is dead, long live the king. We all have to grow to be the king of our own worlds. And it's, first of all, the difficulty we have is overcoming the past. And when we overcome the past,
that's absolutely true.
We have a possibility. We have only a possibility to step into a new world. But there will still be bits of dirt hanging on to us.
No, as long as we use the dirt to grow roses.
Yeah.
No, I think that's lovely. But I don't think there are only going to be more kings. I think the kings are...
No, I don't. I mean it metaphorically. I don't mean it literally. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You become your own person.
Yeah. Okay. If we're going to nitpick here, I won't use that metaphor any longer.
Those kings, they really got us into deep shit.
Probably not the one to use in your case. Yeah. Now, interesting enough, as you spoke about, different backgrounds and so forth, and female and male,
yes.
I think it'd probably be worthwhile to do a little study of the manner in which Celtic women live their lives, as opposed to when the Normans arrived.
Yes.
Celtic women had a completely different relationship with the males. They owned property, they were educated, whereas Norman women were considered something to be used to form alliances. Yep. Now, where did the Normans come from? Well, the Danes, the Vikings, exactly, who came to Normandy, who King John, to confine them in one place, gave them a heap of land, which wasn't enough for them. They eventually got to England by the prowess of their right arms, and eventually came here. And presumably you're a Scian of that grouping. So you've made a huge trip in your life, and well done. And I mean, you were able to, which I thought was an extraordinarily brave thing to do, to stand in front of your ancestral home and apologize for an aspect that you saw as being negative.
Well, I thought that was very kind of you to say so, Michael.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was deserved. I thought it was something that it was the minimum, almost, facing the reality.
You still did it.
Yeah.
You still did it. You still made, whether 2 people or 3 people, you put it out there.
Yeah.
It's in the stratosphere.
Yeah.
It's available to anybody who wishes to view it.
I'm all pleased because it hasn't stopped, has it?
Absolutely not, because the residue continues.
Oh my word.
Yeah.
Oh my word.
It just transforms. It's like the virus. A new variant comes out and it manifests in a different kind of behavior. I mean, I always find it amazing when I drive around our countryside and I see eagles in front of bungalows and...
Yeah, it's hysterical.
Yeah, well, it's indicative.
It's bigger than the house.
Sure, because it's an aping of something that has gone by, which represented something that has long passed, but nevertheless is necessary for these people. And it is allowed. They are allowed to do it.
Of course.
And it would be helpful if one day they stood in front of the eagles and went, oh. And see the incongruity of the whole thing.
The next generation.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure. The next generation will, but it'll manifest in a different way then. But these are necessary. The manifestations are necessary. They're what tell us how wrong we're going or how right we're going or whatever,
Mm. Can I ask you one final little
okay.
nugget?
Yeah.
Before I say thank you very much, which is I heard a rumour that you wrote a book.
I did.
Can you tell us what the name of the book is, and can people get access to it?
Oh, well, I wrote a book about my experiences in Alice Springs, and the book originally, when I wrote it, was called Spuds in the Desert.
Right.
Because I actually grew potatoes, and they grow magnificently in the red dirt of Alice Springs if you add water.
You add water, right? And get the missing ingredient.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was, or people told me that was not as successful. Whatever. Anyway, it ended up being desert dreaming. And
I thought I turned it off. Sorry.
And
I did turn it off. That's weird. Oh well.
Maybe we don't want to talk about that. Yeah, it was a limited edition.
The reason I think it's interesting
Yeah.
is because, I mean, I don't know you well. I feel I know you a lot better than I might, given our short acquaintance, because you've very interesting and great experiences and a lot of resonance between your journey and mine. And you've spoken about things like the recognition of the difference between absolute and relative.
Yes, yes. And I think, Tom, the interesting one there, just to finish on that, the interesting thing there is the third one is where you merge the two, where you're able to contain them both simultaneously. Because the relative is what allows us to grow our consciousness. It also contains us because we can't be the best. For a lot of people, they just give up trying. But what we ultimately have to do is we have to merge. I think this is the conclusion I'm coming to. We have to merge the two.
Yeah.
And that's what consciousness is. That's what do they call it when the Buddha reaches enlightenment? I think that's what enlightenment is, where they contain both simultaneously without any kind of interference of the brain. So you plug in to the
universe. Yes, I like that idea. I'm sure it's there. I'm sure it's possible. I don't know how else I could have known that, my granny on the other side of the world was not well. For example.
Yes.
I think something like love, which is not defined, neither, in science or in, common language. There's something there. I mean, we came through to the conclusion that love is the difference, but there's something in there which is beyond ourselves. It's a dynamic which is external to ourselves. It's a part of that behavior, that emerging behavior of the universe. We may not understand it, but if we can accept it and be a part of it,
we can progress.
You get that experience of flow. I'm sure you've had that experience. For me, I remember it doing windsurfing in particular, but there are other, sporting activities, artistic activities, or even reading. When you suddenly, after several hours in a book, you find yourself actually inhabiting the world in a very different kind of, it's like you sort of take a step through the looking glass. And I think for us to be able to have those experiences, we do have to let go a little bit of the fake world that we've been shown.
Sure. I'm sure for anybody who has the ability to live in that dimension.
So the question is, can people get your book, Spuds in the Desert?
I just have a few copies left.
Good.
But if anybody was...
To send them to your website then?
Yes.
Something.
Yes, Gmail. Unfortunately, in the book, the website is defunct. But I'll give you a copy before you go.
Thanks. Yeah. But I think that would be interesting, because I found it interesting, those points in your emergence. And there was the idea that you picked up. I mean, your interpretation of the Aboriginal culture, I thought that was really fascinating. The idea that people are born and they're told where they exist in the universe.
Yes.
And that gives them their relationships
with every other, with everybody in the world.
And that is a very much bigger mindset than the one we emerge with, a very, very tiny world of maybe the village that we live in. We're never looking to the sky, even that.
And the one thing that they don't share with us is ownership. I mean,
for me, it's ownership is the dirty word.
It's the fundamental of capitalism, isn't it?
The problem is that for us, in our mindset, in our feudal mindset, ownership does not mean ownership, it means control. It means control of others and other stuff. Whereas, in reality, what ownership is its responsibility. And if we can take the responsibility, we definitely don't want to own it all. Because we can't handle the responsibility.
Well, interesting enough, for the Aborigines, ownership wasn't their problem, but power was still a problem. And for my man, he actually welcomed alcohol because alcohol allowed for the breakdown of the traditional power structure, which for him defined what woman he would marry.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Interesting, huh?
It's a bit difficult, isn't it?
Interesting.
Yeah, because you do have to break out of those kinds of traditions. I think that's where you have the traditions. That's it's that kind of problem that I have with things like yoga, which obviously offer a great deal of wisdom, but because they are not challenged, because they cannot evolve with the new ideas, they are very dangerous.
Yes. Well, all structures.
Dogma is dangerous.
All structures are only good for a particular time and place, but I mean they have to be transcended. And it's knowing when and how is the difficulty. And for him, and often we get caught up in the emotion of the passing of the thing rather than the actual where it leads to. So, for instance, with the Aborigines, we get caught up with the alcohol and all the rest of it. But for some forms of thinking, they would say, unfortunately, it was necessary for them. In the same way that you could say that the Celtics needed the Normans to come so the intellect could develop somewhat. Their emotion and their intuition and all the rest of it was quite advanced, but their intellect had been left behind. So when the Normans came, they found it extremely easy to subvert the Irish way of life, the Celtic way of life. The Celtic, I might add, not the Irish. They simply brought the square, a shape that we were not familiar with. And they were able to subjugate the country. So the passing of something we can get consumed by. But actually where it leads to is probably more important. And for me, the house that I built here is a six-sided structure, which was the subverting of the Celtic and the Norman. It's joining the square with the circle to make the cell, the six-sided cell.
The natural form.
Of
the
bee, the honeycomb, or whatever. Yeah. Anyway.
No, it's wonderful and it's a great feeling.
Yeah.
And thank you very much, Michael. You're
my pleasure.
My pleasure. And thanks for sharing with everybody because we can learn.
Oh, we all
have courage.
Yeah. Oh, look, I don't have that much. I don't have that much courage.
Smile.
Yeah. I don't have that. I seriously don't have that much courage. Most of the things I've done in my life, Tom, have been because I was forced to, not because I have the courage to do it. I think
you weren't forced into the nomadic lifestyle in Alice Springs. Right?
I don't know.
You weren't forced to create a paradise and to preserve a paradise and to rebuild a paradise. The hedgerows, the livestock, the nature, you can hear it and see it, the floral activity, it's just a...
Yeah, that's a
bounty.
Yeah, it's a consequence of my cowardice. No, I think it just amazes me that so many people in the country want to give up what they have to move to the city, and so many people in the city want to give up what they have in the city to move to the country, you know. It's not where we are, it's how we are.
It's the green fence, it's looking out the edge at the neighbour, to some extent.
Yeah, it doesn't happen like that though. It doesn't happen like that, you know. I mean, it's any transformation you make in your life is an arduous journey.
Yes, I wish I'd known that.
So do we all.
I thought I'd be finished in a year.
Yeah.
Everything would be done.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
Built, the family would be sorted. But...
Did I tell you about my Oisin moment?
Go on.
When I arrived on this farm, it had been derelict. It was my family, my father was born here in 1897 and he left in 1914. and never came back. Well, he used to visit, and I used to visit with him. Anyway, it was derelict, more or less, for years before I arrived, and it hadn't been worked since the Second World War. So you can imagine what it was like. So when I arrived, there was no key for the door. The door was locked. So I had to climb in through a back window, and the place had been rifled. Everything was removed. There was nothing left. The only thing that was there was a wheelbarrow, upturned, in the middle of the cement floor in the kitchen. And I, somewhere in my brain, just barely approaching consciousness, realized this was an Oisin moment. Oisin, when he went to Tirnanog to marry the princess, he got homesick and he wished to return to his homeland. And the princess gave him a white horse with a beautiful saddle and said to him, under no circumstances, get down off the horse. But when he came back to the land of his youth, he saw some old men trying to move a huge stone. And he bent down to lift the stone, and the girth of the saddle broke, and he hit the ground and turned into a 100-year-old man. In the same way, I had this second of realization that if I touched that wheelbarrow, but the stupidity of enthusiasm, I upturned the wheelbarrow. And to this day, 40 years later, I'm still here.
Thanks for turning over the wheelbarrow. Thanks for turning over the wheelbarrow.
We'll have a cup of tea, Tom.